Hi everybody, Mr. Farmer here, and today we're talking in AP Macroeconomics about problems, criticisms, and complications of fiscal policies. So how effective are fiscal policies? We're going to run into a thing called the crowding out effect, which is going to deal with the government debt. We'll talk mostly about United States government debt, but could often go into a lot of other places as well. And also just some kind of concerns, some true, some not so true. So let's go ahead and get started. So as far as how effective they are, we need to talk about future policy reversals. So I have this cartoon up here, which I really think speaks to this. We have this little guy right here saying, "Eat me, so delicious, eat me all up." And we have the first major setback in the study of reverse psychology. It might not work out with this guy, and I do like he's taken some observation and data points. Now, why do I bring this up? When you're talking about fiscal policies, mostly things like taxes, there's a question of, will these taxes stay permanent or mostly permanent? If people think it's just going to be like a year-long type tax increase and or decrease, they might not change their habits. And so if the goal is to change the economy, as in if you want to cool down the economy, you want to raise up taxes, will people actually spend less, or will they just kind of endure for a year or so? And so the way to combat this is to make sure it's a long enough time period. So most taxes, when they're implemented, are usually for a minimum of 7 years, and then they can be redone and checked off again to go on for another one. So the more permanent these changes are, the more likely people will actually react accordingly. Increase in taxes, how long that's going to be? 7 years. Think of where you'd be in 7 years. How much planning, how much stuff would happen. You're probably going to change your spending habits accordingly. What if it was only for the next year? Okay, maybe you don't change around too much. And then we get into, again, more fiscal policies. When we're talking about federal, it might be offset by state and local finance. State and local governments have different requirements. The Balanced Budget Act is for states. The federal government in the United States doesn't have to be balanced. And so, for instance, in the 1930s, for instance, there's an increase in federal spending. What happened is state and local governments actually spent less. Hey, you're going to do the road repair? Great, that means we don't need to. So yes, the government, the federal government, increased their spending for the roadways or construction or whatever else it was, but do all levels do that? Or do some areas go, oh, thank you, now we don't have to try and find that extra money, so it might be decreased. So again, how large, how effective are fiscal policies? Might not be as big as we've been talking about. Okay, so overall impact on fiscal policies. So now we just talked about taxes. Now we're going to talk about the spending portion. So we got to kind of bring up two questions here. Where does the money come from for government policies, for these spending increases and decreases potentially also? And then how does acquisition, the property of these potentially affect the economy? How do they get access to the money? And since the government has access, where does that domino effect come in? So we're going to have this thing called crowding out effect, and we're going to come back to this in later chapters once we've talked about another graph. But for now, let's assume there's a limited amount of money in the economy. So if the government starts to spend more, what happens to the other spenders, the households, the businesses? Let's just not worry about the international stuff for a second. So government spends more. Is there still just as much for the other places to go? No, the households and businesses would therefore have less because there's a struggle going on down here. So essentially, as the government starts to spend more money, the others can't spend as much. They're crowded out of being able to spend. So for instance, if we have an expansionary fiscal policy, and whenever we talk about this, we're going to assume it is a discretionary policy. We're not going to worry about the non-discretionary, passive, automatic policies. We're going to assume if something like this is talked about, it is discretionary. So there's an increase in government spending. This means an increase in the demand for money because the government is going to spend more. Well, without thinking about the graph or anything, if there's an increase in demand for something, that usually increases the price of that thing. In this case, it's borrowed money. So if we take that, that means then there's an increase in the price for borrowed money. Okay. If there's an increase in the demand for money and the increase in the price for borrowed money, then the private sections, the households and businesses, they won't be able to borrow as much because those interest rates will be higher. And as we talked about with the investment demand curve, if interest rates are higher, people tend to borrow less. So again, the government has crowded out the private sectors, the households and businesses, from spending money. So again, how effective are fiscal policies? There are some drawbacks. So again, stimulating the economy, it might actually, the crowding out effect can weaken, maybe cancel it out. It's hard to say for that one. So why is this the case? Well, the government, we presume, will borrow some of the money that it does spend. So it's not that there's only $100 in the economy. No, it comes from somewhere. Okay. Thus, we have this thing called the crowding out effect. So this is a graph we're going to talk more about, so I'm not going to spend time on it here, but it's called the loanable funds graph. And this is what I was talking about earlier. As the demand for those loanable funds increases, the interest rates go up. Then people borrow less. This is that private sector, the households, businesses, they're going to borrow less money. And if interest rates are increased, there's a decrease in the aggregate demand curve, the whole C plus I plus G plus net exports. And so again, there's an increase, there's a stimulation of the economy based on the increase in government spending. But then there's going to be a slight, according to this concept, the crowding out effect over here, there's going to be a decrease in households and businesses from spending their money. So again, let's just look at some numbers. Don't worry about the specifics here, but the idea is that the government, and I'm talking United States specifically, but most major economies, major countries borrow money and are in debt, either to themselves, to their own banks, or to international groups, entities, whoever else it is. Okay, it's definitely not just the United States. But with that said, in the United States, the debt held by the public in 2017 was $14 trillion. 2018 is 14.8. Intergovernmental holdings, that means the U.S. government owed itself $5.5 trillion and then $5.7 trillion there. So then the total was 19.9 and then 20.4. Today, 2021, it's somewhere around $29 trillion. You can go to nationaldebtclock.org and you can actually get real-time stuff if you're curious. Just go ahead and just type in National Debt Clock and it'll pop right up for you guys. So again, the reason to show this is not to like, oh, we're United States is really in debt, but it's the idea that the government borrows money. And if they borrow money, that money's come from somewhere. So we're kind of linking again to this crowding out effect. And these specific numbers aren't going to be helpful for us though. So who owns, again, this is just talking about the government borrows money. So how are they able to borrow money? Well, treasury bills, short-term securities, okay? The Federal Reserve, okay, is actually one that prints the U.S. money. And so those are treasury bills, the Federal Reserve bills. Those are debts that the U.S. government owes back to the Federal Reserve. Again, more about that later on. So that's how you can borrow that money, is they borrow it from the Federal Reserve, okay? And that piece of paper is they're saying, we're going to pay it back. Or you can actually get a treasury bill where you can actually borrow that, or they would borrow money from whoever is buying this and they pay some interest back. And bonds are kind of an overall type thing. Usually it's more long-term, couple months, 9 months to years for bonds, savings bonds. Again, all these are ways that the government borrows money, which is why there's interest on the budget every single year. It grows more and more and more. So again, are these specific things important? No. The takeaway is that the government, United States and others, borrow money when they spend. And so if they do a fiscal policy, the assumption is they're borrowing some money in order to fulfill that spending. That's what we're linking to, that concept. So who owns it? People are just always curious about this. This is not current to 2021, but it's going to be pretty similar. So you can see the biggest portion, and this includes international, is actually the Federal Reserve and then the government accounts. That would be the intergovernmental holdings. Foreign and international is in 22.7. That's not necessarily just the governments. It's actually a lot of international banks that own that. And then private pension funds, mutual funds, state and local governments own some. And you can see people invest in these into bond markets. If you have a U.S. bond, you have bought part of the U.S. debt, which means until you make claim back for that, the U.S. government or whoever that bond is from, they get to use your money, that expansionary fiscal policy, or expansionary fiscal policy. And as again, these specifics aren't important. It's just the idea that the government borrows money. Internationally, yes, the largest international group by itself is China. You can see it's a whole bunch of all other U.S. debt held by foreigners is just a big section here. But then the majority is actually held by the Federal Reserve or within the United States itself. But the single country, and it's actually mostly banks, is the Chinese banks that own most of the debt that's held outside the United States. Again, people are always curious about that, so just kind of throwing that in for you guys. So then we talk about debt and GDP. So the United States has a very large debt. Again, currently it's $29 trillion, which is just an unfathomable number, actually. We just kind of say it like it's a win, but $29 trillion, it's a scary amount. But is that okay? And this is actually an evolving conversation with more recent type discussions. But historically, the thinking has been as long as the debt is less than your annual GDP, what people call debt to GDP ratio, you're okay. So as long as you have less than 100% debt to GDP, you're okay. If you're over, that can be a problematic, and actually there's more conversation about that, which we can get into later. So the idea is that governments with larger GDPs, according to this theory, are okay holding a larger amount of debt. For instance, in 1940 to 2008, the debt to GDP ratio was actually pretty okay. It was less than 100%. Okay, and then we get to later years. So United States is kind of this little beige pink one, and so that would be the United States. And in 2011, you can see we actually did cross the debt to GDP ratio. Greece, quite a bit above. Again, this is only 2012, so we're missing the last couple of years. But you can see a lot of people during this time. This would be the Great Recession occurring, so you can see debts definitely went up during this time period. So again, conversations have shifted the last 10 years on this topic. So some false claims. Bankruptcy. The idea is that a government can never really go bankrupt, and the idea is because they can always sell new bonds and securities in order to repay those maturing. Now, this is a bit like paying a credit card with another credit card, but as long as people are still willing to buy and invest into governmental bonds, this will still be true because somebody will always be willing to buy that $100 bond that's good for 10 years. So that government then gets $100 for the next 10 years. And then for 10 years, they'll have to pay it back and interest and all those kinds of things. So they can never really go bankrupt is the concept. Second part is the government can technically always increase taxation. Now, can they actually do this? Again, it's a bit of a political science question as far as can they do this and should they do this. But technically, they can do this. Now, this also goes to a thing called the debt ceiling, which is in the United States, the amount of debt the Congress says is okay to hold. And as long as you're underneath that threshold, you're good. The shutdowns in the United States the last couple of years have been because that debt ceiling got approached. So they had to shut down non-essential parts of the government in order to make sure they stayed below that threshold. And Congress can then eventually say, yes, we can increase that threshold, that limit. And as soon as they did, that's when we started resuming typical functions, which would be like national monuments would be something that might be shut down during that time. Yes, we still had school. So burdening future generations, most of the debt is held by U.S. agencies. So approximately 25% is owned by foreign hands. So let's do this hypothetical. If securities were all called in, okay, 80% of it would stay domestically. So the other 20% would have to be paid to, and that's money that would be forever gone. So how would that be paid? Because right now the U.S. government doesn't have that. They're in debt. Well, they would presumably have to increase taxes in order to pay that. Now, most of that increase in taxes would then get filtered back to the 80% people who actually owned the U.S. securities and bonds and everything else. So purchasing power would not change a lot. I'm not talking about economic income equality. Definitely there would be a big change there for economic equality there. But the idea is that it would mostly stay in the United States. The big problem is actually the 20-25% that would go outside the United States. Because that's money that would, if that was the end of the line, stay there. So all of a sudden the United States would be worth 20-25 less than it currently is. So internationally, that would be an issue. The US dollar would be worth 25% less than it is. So if you want to buy something, you have to pay 25% more US dollars in order to buy it. It would be a big issue internationally. So again, then we get to the income distribution incentives. Would you still want to work if you get taxed that high? The amount of debt that's owned by the public. So yes, it is a big deal that we have debt and that high of a debt in the United States and everywhere else. There are ways around it, and this conversation is still going. And again, all this is going back to the government does borrow money, and there are issues. And if we connect that to fiscal policies, well, where does that money come from? It's borrowed from somewhere. If it's borrowed from that bank, then that means that bank can't lend it out to the private sector. So again, that crowding out effect. So again, that income distribution, maybe some of that money goes back over to somewhere else. So government securities could definitely be uneven. More will be owned by the wealthier groups. So again, in this hypothetical, everybody calls for securities back. There would probably be a larger economic decline there as far as the equality gap. The incentives, part of the debt is the interest being paid, and so payment for this is taken out of taxes. So the higher the taxes, okay, maybe you don't want to start a business if your taxes are that much higher. There's even more crocodiles to get going. And then again, that foreign-owned public debt, as far as that is money, that is assets that are just leaving the United States and we're not going to be seeing again. So again, there are definitely some major concerns with this. As far as bankruptcy, that's a false concern though. So again, the kind of going back, because I know we kind of went over all over the places, is this crowding out effect. It can definitely drive up interest rates. People will then spend less money. Future generations may reduce supplying capacity, since businesses may be less inclined to get started in the first place. Potentially reduce standard of living. These are all the downsides potentially to fiscal policies and stimulus. Stimulating the economy through the spending. Now, people also praise this idea and kind of getting the ball started, and we're going to deal with this debt concept later on. That's a whole nother conversation, actually, and it's a widening conversation as far as how much is okay. So why spend the money? Why should the government spend the money? Well, spending on public goods may outweigh the effects in the private sector. Public investment can increase production capacity even through public sector. So that money, if the government is spending it, would still get spent, and they would get to choose where it is. Okay, so yes, there's a decrease in spending in the private, but there's also an increase in spending in the public. Decrease of jobs in the private, increase of jobs in the public. So again, it's a toss-up and kind of goes into which do you think is better, and people are on both sides of this fence. So again, what we're talking about is how effective are these fiscal policies? Well, we've got to look at this thing called the crowding out effect, and a major portion of that is that the government borrows money when they increase their spending. Okay, and there's some concerns about that. Some very valid and some are not so valid. All right, until next time.